I'm Kelsey. This is my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I'm wearing my fancy booktube hat, and today I'm bringing you a little bit of a double DiverseAthon wrap-up video of a wrap-up of the novellas and short fiction that I read during the DiverseAthon week, and also a little mini Diversa haul of some books that I acquired during the DiverseAthon week and immediately after when I was thinking about acquiring some diverse books. So basically, I didn't really have the pre-planning time to plan a full week of like diverse novel reading for the DiverseAthon, so I kept working on the books I was already reading during the week. And what I did was I added in 2 bound published novellas in book form and some other short fiction that is available for free online. I'm going to honestly tell you that I'm not sure this was the best way to diversify my reading. I'm not sure I was able to put as much thought into it as I would have liked to. I did stay well in my comfort zone in terms of genre. These are all SFF, most of them somehow based on folklore or fairy tales or mythology of some sort. I think that all of the diversity that was presented in the stories that I read was ethnic or cultural diversity. I didn't read any stories that had LGBTQ plus themes, and I didn't read stories with or about disability. I also didn't participate in any of the Twitter discussions, mostly because the format daunted me because I'm bad at Twitter, but I did watch them happening a bit online, and I really appreciated this week that the booktube community as a whole sort of decided to take to think about diversifying our reading and what that means for us and how we can challenge ourselves to maybe read more diversely than we would otherwise. I think it's easy to fall into a sort of default of not reading diversely without even realizing it, just because I started to notice walking into like used bookstores where I do most of my shopping, oh my gosh, I wouldn't even notice that none of these books I'm looking at are diverse here. Okay, so enough of the intro. The first book I read was Binti by Nnedi Okorafor. This is really very short, but I thought it was very impressive. This is a sci-fi story about a young woman named Binti who has been accepted with honors to this prestigious interstellar university. She's a person of color. She comes from a decidedly African culture that is a minority in her world. Her people are considered to be sort of tribal by the rest of human civilization, even though by our standards they're very technologically advanced. But they believe very much in keeping to themselves and staying at home, and so Binti ends up defying her family and running away to go to this university. On her way there, disaster strikes, there are aliens, and this book is very much about diversity, at least that's how I read it. It's Binti's different way of looking at the world that ends up saving the day in this story. The world building is sort of confusing because it's so slim and you get the sense that you're just sort of peeking into this huge thing that you don't get to see much of. Binti is like a math genius working with technology that seems to border almost on the mystical. Anyways, what I appreciated most about this story was that even though some terrible, terrible things happen in this story, it ultimately felt like it was a very optimistic narrative to me. The next thing I read was actually the longest, and this is another novella, Six Gun Snow White by Catherynne and Valente. This was my book that I had that isn't Own Voices. So this is a story about a character who is biracial and half Native American from an author who, as far as I know, isn't Native American and doesn't have that heritage. And I, as a white person myself, feel challenged because I'm not myself really in a position to tell by reading this whether or not this is the sort of representation that is positive or constructive. It feels that way to me, but I don't identify with this group, so I'm not really in a position to say. Catherynne and Valente does identify as queer, though, and I think if you're looking for that, you can see that in this book, even though it's not front and center. But this is a Western fantasy retelling of Snow White, and I was actually kind of pleasantly surprised by how accessible this was. The other novella-length story I've read of hers was Silently and Very Fast. I read this in a collection called The Melancholy of McGuire, but that novella, Silently and Very Fast, I thought was totally brilliantly stunning. It was sci-fi with fairy tales and mythology used to tell it. But it was very, very dense and very hard to pick apart. It took a lot of really active reading. And while this does still get sort of weird in places, it was nowhere near as dense as that novella. But I was thinking about this, and as a fairy tale retelling, I think this might be my favorite creative take on Snow White I've ever read. It used every element of the story, but still made it all feel completely fresh and new in a way that I was really happy with. I also thought I saw a few references to other fairy tales and stories in here, and I'm wondering if there were even more that I missed. There might have been. The chapter titles are all somewhat obscure, and I'm thinking that some of them might be references to things that I'm missing. The first portion of this book is narrated in first person by Snow White, and then the rest of the book is narrated in the third person. There's a narrative shift that happens there. But the story itself is fairly straightforward. This is about a girl who comes to be named Snow White. We don't know what her name originally was. She is the daughter of a very wealthy, powerful man who owns mining operations in the Wild West. And she tells us that her mother was a crow woman whom her father forced to marry him, who died in childbirth, and that he basically kept the fact that that marriage had happened a secret, and she eventually learns as she gets older that she is also being kept a secret. When he marries again, publicly this time, Snow White acquires a stepmother, and she brings magic and sorcery into the story, and Snow White and her stepmother have this really unhealthy relationship, obviously, but it's based on Snow White needing a mother figure, and her stepmother basically telling her, like, you can strive to achieve my love by becoming more white. And so she names the girl Snow White and does things like bathing her in ice-cold milk to try to make her more white. Eventually she runs away from this situation and has adventures as a gunslinger in the Wild West. I really liked that in this story the dwarfs are a town run entirely by women who have escaped terrible situations in their lives and have created their own community. So in terms of the diversity, this has a strong element that is about race, and I thought that was handled well. It doesn't really go into Native American culture, though, because Snow White is raised in a white family and she never knows her mother's people. There's a moment where the third-person narrator of the second half of the book speculates that if she had gone a different way on her road and gone to her mother's people, then they wouldn't have recognized her as one of them either. She doesn't have a place in either world. Anyhow, I thought this was a lot about being a woman without a place in the world, and a lot about the desire for a mother figure. And I did, in fact, really like this. I gave it 4 stars. This is a newer edition of this novella that has been published with a few illustrations scattered throughout. I didn't think they were that impressive or contributed that much to the story, but they're there in this edition. Now on to the online short fiction that I read. I have a hard time reading on my computer screen, so when it's an option, I tend to print out short stories that are available for free online. So I've got 3 of those here. The first one is novella length, and that is The Pauper Prince and the Eucalyptus Jinn by Usman Malik. This is available online at tor.com. I'll provide the link. I think it's also available as an ebook. The author here is a Pakistani-American, so is the protagonist of this story. We start out when the protagonist is a boy, and his grandfather tells a story that many people sort of dismiss as a fairy tale about how when he was growing up in Pakistan, there was an impoverished princess of a defunct regime who ran a tea shop in his neighborhood that had a giant eucalyptus tree in front of it, in which she said there was a Jinn that was protecting her family. Then we skip ahead to a time when our protagonist is grown up, and he is a professor, and his grandfather dies, so he has to go home and help clean through his grandfather's things. He finds some journals that tell him that maybe there was more to that story than he thought. He ends up taking a trip back to Pakistan to Lahore to try to get to the root of this sort of mystical mystery. This story becomes increasingly fantastical as it gets towards the end. I thought that for a relatively short piece of fiction, it did a very good job of tackling, you know, big mysteries of the universe type things. It seems to me that that would be very hard to do in something this short, but this felt very well crafted to me, and I really enjoyed it. And as something that is Own Voice's contemporary fiction about a culture that I really know very little about, I had the experience of just sort of immersing myself in a story and letting it teach me something. And I knew that I wasn't understanding everything in this story because I was reading about a culture that I don't really know much about, and that was okay. And the last 2 things that I read, I actually read them at different points during the week, so they weren't actually the last things that I read, but they're the shortest things, so I stuck them in this wrap-up last. Were 2 very short stories by Roshani Chokshi. You may recognize the name. She's a YA author whose debut novel, The Star-Touched Queen, has been making its rounds on BookTube and has been getting a good deal of hype. That is on my TBR. If I had been reading full-length novels for DiverseAThon, I might have ended up reading it. But as I wasn't, I remembered that I had stumbled across one of her short stories online on I think it's a Tumblr page called The Hanging Garden, where a group of YA authors all post very short fiction. And I had read one of her stories before there, and I had really liked it. I'm blanking on the name of the story. That one was The Imperfect Gift. I remembered thinking that one was very clever. It did the sort of thing that I've heard The Star-Touched Queen does, which was to take a theme from classical mythology and to put an Indian cultural spin on it. And I had recognized the basic mythological theme from that story and thought that the setting provided a really interesting take on it. So I went back to see if she had other stories on there, and she did. She has 2 other stories on there, and I read both of them during this week. And I have to say, I didn't like either of these quite as much. The first one I read was this one, Items for Sale in the Encanto's Market. And I read it, and then I read pieces of it again. It's just like a few pages long, and I just feel like I didn't get it. I mean, I think I got the thematic basics out of it eventually. I had a hard time putting together the story that was happening here from the pieces of text that were involved. I know that's a very dry sounding way of putting it, but it seems accurate to me. This indicates at the end that it's based on Filipino mythology, and I don't know anything about Filipino mythology though. So maybe if I did, this would have made a whole lot more sense to me and I would have gotten more of what she was going for. And this other one, I didn't like quite as much because it felt over-obvious to me, which was sort of the exact opposite problem. This is Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf? And this is a 1920s flapper era retelling of Little Red Riding Hood, or maybe less of a retelling and more just a contemplation of the themes of Little Red Riding Hood. I think you have to have some really good ideas about Little Red Riding Hood to make me interested in your musings on the themes of it. This just wasn't quite up to snuff for me. So if you wanted to read one of Roshani Chokshi's short stories, I would actually recommend the one that I didn't read during the DiverseAthon week that I read several months ago. So I will link all 3 of them for you. If you want to take a look at them, I would like to know what you think of the 3. They're all very different, and they're all very short. So anyhow, yes, these were the short things that I read during the DiverseAthon week. If you read any of these for DiverseAthon, or if you've read any of them not for DiverseAthon, I would like to hear about your experiences with them and how your experience might have compared to my experience with them. Yeah, so on to part 2 of this video. I have a little mini DiverseAhaul because I realized that I just don't own on my owned TBR shelf a whole lot of diverse books right now. And it's not something that's conscious, it's something that needs to be consciously corrected though if I want to read diversely, and I do, I want to read diversely. So during the week of DiverseAthon I was actively looking to purchase and acquire some books that are diverse in terms of both diverse authors and diverse characters, because I wanted to make a commitment to continuing to read more diversely in the future. So the first book I've got here is actually an ARC. I have some access to ARCs from a bookstore where I volunteer, and this one is getting some hype right now, and that is Of Fire and Stars by Audrey Coulthurst. And this is sort of meant to rectify the fact that I didn't really have any LGBT stories in what I read this past week. This is a YA fantasy novel about a princess that is meant to have a lesbian romance in it. And I haven't read that before. I've heard that it's also Own Voices, and it has a lot of people really excited to see this sort of representation in this genre. And I'm looking forward to seeing what sort of story this is. Next, I've got a couple of used books. The first is a book that was on my TBR already, but I didn't own a copy. I would have gotten it from the library if I hadn't found it. But this is The 100,000 Kingdoms by N.K. Jemisin, who is a female fantasy author of color. This is the first book in her Inheritance trilogy, which is a completed series. She is now writing the Broken Earth series that starts with the 5th season. The Obelisk Gate is now out. I would really like to read this series first, though, and I was really pleased to find a copy of the first book. The next book I found at a used bookstore, so it's technically used, although I find that fairly amusing, because this is a finished copy, but it isn't out until early October. So some reviewer got their finished copy fairly early and decided to straight away dump it at a used bookstore. So this is When the Sea Turned Silver by Grace Lynn, which is not out until next month, and it is a gorgeous, gorgeous hardcover. Look how pretty. Yes, you see how pretty? Grace Lynn is a Chinese-American author who writes, among other things, children's fantasy novels based on Chinese mythology. I read Where the Mountain Meets the Moon, which was her first of these books. I'll link the wrap-up for you where I talked about that. I really liked it. These books have stories nested in stories, which is something I really like. They also have beautiful color illustrations. One of the things that draws me to these books is I'm very interested in Asian-inspired fantasy books, but more often than not, when I see them, they are written by white authors. And that I find puzzling. And I don't think I'm going to stop reading Asian-inspired fantasy by white authors, because there's a good amount of it I actually want to read. But I've been aware for a while that I should be looking out for more fantasy that's actually written by Asian or Asian American authors. I've read some early Goodreads reviews that say that the stories in these books, Where the Mountain Meets the Moon, Starry River of the Sky, and this one, sometimes reference each other, even though each of these is completely a standalone story on its own. So I may try to get Starry River from the Sky from the library and read it before I start in on this. But this is so pretty, and it isn't out yet, and it's a finished copy, and I got it used. And the last book I have here, I got at the Brooklyn Book Fair on Sunday. I went to the Brooklyn Book Fair for the first time, and I think I'm going to do a whole video about my experience because it was a little overwhelming, but I had a lot of fun. And one of the things I attended 3 panel discussions, and the one that I thought was most exciting of the 3 was the panel discussion on gender and diversity in SFF, and I took a lot of notes, and I'd like to sort of share some of those notes with you if I can manage to sort through them and figure out what is most noteworthy. But I ended up only buying 1 book. I was sort of more there for the panel discussions than the book buying, and sort of because it was overwhelming and I didn't know where to look, I didn't know what to buy, I didn't know where to go. But the book that I did get is actually one I've already read, and I wasn't going to purchase this book, but it was 50% off, and I got a free tote bag with it. And it is Every Heart a Doorway by Seannan and McGuire, which is a diverse book because it has an asexual protagonist, it has a transgender character, it has a Japanese American character, it has a very diverse cast of characters. And it was 50% off, and there was a free tote bag involved, and it doesn't take up that much space on my shelf. So I didn't overwhelmingly love this book as much as a lot of other people did, but the reason was purely because I had a really hard time with the gory, dismembered corpses and the murders and so forth. The characters really stuck with me though, and they have still stuck with me. So now that I own a copy, I've significantly increased my chances that I will reread it someday, and honestly, this is such a short book. It's the sort of book that I could sit down and reread in like a day. And I don't know what I'll feel when I reread it. I don't know if I'll get to the parts that are gory and disturbing and be like, oh, Kelsey, you knew this was coming. Why did you buy this book? Why are you making yourself reread this book? Or if I'll get to those parts and I'll know that they're coming and I'll just be okay with it and I'll be very happy with myself. So this is my little mini 4-book diverse haul. I hope you enjoyed it. I would like to know if you have bought any diverse books recently. Talk to me about whatever you want. As always, I would love to hear your comments. I think that is all. Bye for now.